Hey everybody, and welcome to Future Nonprofit, a podcast and YouTube channel where we talk with nonprofit practitioners and industry experts about how to build and scale the nonprofit of tomorrow. I'm Ted Vaughn, partner at Historic and host of Future Nonprofit, and today we talk with Hannah Song, the president and CEO of Liberty in North Korea. I am so excited about this episode because Hannah is literally trying to rebrand North Korea. Why? Well, you'll have to listen to find out, but it's an amazing story. I would love for you to check out more episodes. We talk with incredible leaders, again, from industry and nonprofit practitioners. Join me as we unpack the stories of today's most innovative leaders to help nonprofits contribute more good to our world. Okay, so getting to know you, your career began in advertising. Was that your goal when you were going to school?
To be honest, it was not really where I had planned to be. I think what I've realized when I kind of reflect back on my life, it's always a sort of series of happy accidents or unintentional happenings. So in school, I studied communications and kind of thought that I would go into television. So throughout school, I worked and interned at different television stations for different shows, thinking that that was going to be the industry or the field that I went into. And when I graduated, had this one job interview, and it was exactly what I wanted to do. And I absolutely bombed the interview. It was terrible. I was like, I got one shot and I totally blew it. So after that, I was just sort of applying for just jobs anywhere. And I had a friend who worked at the agency, and they just said they're constantly hiring. And so I applied and somehow got this job, and it was fantastic. I loved working in the industry. It was so interesting. It was so fun. And it was not at all what my intention was, but I am so grateful for the opportunity I had to both have corporate experience, but also to have worked in that industry, because I think it really helped to shape a lot of kind of how I think about even the work we're doing today.
Yeah, I really want to revisit that. But before we go down what will be, I'm sure, a meaningful conversation about how your skill and expertise in that area translates to your nonprofit leadership. But tell me how you got into the nonprofit space from agency world and advertising.
So growing up, I always sort of had an interest in the Holocaust. I think it was the confluence of just learning about the issue in school, and maybe Schindler's List came out at that time. Maybe it had already been out. Probably wasn't a typical film a young person would be watching, but
Great movie, though.
Fantastic.
Great movie.
And I remembered being young and watching this film, and it was really challenging. I think it was a very heart-wrenching film to watch. It was difficult to believe that this had happened at some point in history. Clearly not the time that we were living in then or now, but it was a very interesting sort of moral quandary, what people went through, the decisions they have to make, the sacrifices they make sometimes to help others, and even beyond that. And sort of you're taken in this film through the main character's lens, like what he goes through owning the factory and the decisions and sacrifices he makes to use what he has to help people. But it was really the opportunity to also understand. You get a glimpse of what life was like for so many of these Jews that were in these camps, that were going through this experience. I think that really resonated with me. I would read a lot of memoirs, biographies about people who had lived and survived in the camps. I think the psychology of that was very interesting. But I just had this big fascination in the Holocaust, because I think mostly it was such an atrocity. And it's so hard to understand, how does something that great and grand happen in the world? And yet most of the world probably said they didn't know it was happening, or they didn't necessarily think there was anything they could do. And so when we learn about history so often, I think that that's the boat we're in. We're learning about what's happened in the past. We're reflecting on it. We're thinking about it. We're so used to commemorating and building memorials and kind of trying to remember lives. But then you kind of flip that on its head and say there are so many things happening today, right now, history is being made. And the question is really, well, what am I doing? You know, if I
Hmm.
lived at that time, would I have done something? I think was a question that I asked myself a lot when I was watching these films and reading these books. And I don't know. I think the very hopeful side of, you know, the better angels of our nature sort of thing is, of course we would. Of course, if this was happening in front of us, we would step up and
Sure.
do something.
We all see ourselves through that lens of noble, warrior for the good.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in reality, most Americans, at least, struggle with apathy
Yes.
and complacency. And I want to tease this out a little bit because you've just taken us right there, and this was on my notes. So I'm just going to go there right now.
Okay.
It strikes me that in today's proliferation of communication and media and cause and so many things being so well done, there's this unbelievable need, as you said, as there has been throughout time and history. There's an unbelievable need, but the amount of the overwhelming amount of communication we get as Americans about that need, not just Americans really, but I think we feel it even more, and the overwhelming amount of communication with consumer products, and it seems like it's pushing people more and more into apathy. The need's overwhelming. There's all of these things. It's difficult to get involved. How do you recommend people navigate the onslaught of causes and places to get involved? Like how would you navigate that as a young woman figuring out what you're going to support? Because I'm assuming you support things beyond Link. How do you navigate that? How do you make that choice? How do you make decisions when things are just so overwhelming and there's so much need and so much communicated and so many compelling videos?
I think apathy is so natural. I don't think that it's acceptable, but I think it's understandable. For myself, I have to say there are times that I find myself being apathetic as well. It can be overwhelming. These last few years have been incredibly overwhelming. It's felt like a
Mm-hmm.
massive dumpster fire in the world with everything going on. So it is,
So true.
yeah, I mean, it's only natural sometimes, I think, for us to need to tune out, but I think how we tune out is important too. So the first thing I would say is, um, a guy I used to work with used to say this all the time. He says, you just have to be true to your convictions. And so I think the first thing is really knowing what are your convictions? What are the things that are important to you, that you believe in, that you stand for? And you have to be true to that. And I think that's natural. When something comes up that resonates with you, you'll respond. And I think you just have to you have to follow that feeling. You know, sometimes I will respond more to a certain issue or topic than to another. And that's okay. We don't have to respond equally to all things.
Mm-hmm.
I think that
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's important to also just understand our limitations. I have a limitation of time, attention, resource, donations I can give. And I really have to be very resolute and clear to myself about that and laying that out. And again, I think that's okay too. In some ways, it's sort of just creating these visible and invisible boundaries that I have to just almost write down on a piece of paper for myself to remind myself that
Mm-hmm.
it's okay to, just because I'm not supporting this or reposting this or doing this, it doesn't mean that I don't care about it, but that right now I only have the capacity to
Mm-hmm.
do this right now for this cause or this issue. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's for nothing. I just have to focus on what's going on in my own life and with my family.
So, how did your convictions and how did your choice to not just drift into apathy, which I think is so tempting to do and so easy to do, how did that for you connect to North Korea?
So there were two ways in which I'm connected to this issue. The first is what I had touched on before. I had always had an interest in some of the biggest issues that were happening around us, both in history and also in present day. So years ago, when the genocide in Sudan was happening, I wanted to do something. And I found myself feeling so desperate to want to get involved and do something, but I didn't know how I could do that. At that time, I think I was in college or right out of college, and it was just something that wasn't easily accessible for me to do anything outside of, donating and supporting a cause. And that's not what I wanted to do at the time. So I think I've always had an interest in wanting to do something about these issues. And when I read this book about North Korea, I had no idea it was still happening today. I read a book about a North Korean man. He was 9 years old when he was put into one of North Korea's most brutal political prison camps. And you're wondering, how does a 9-year-old end up in a political prison camp? And that's because 3 generations of his family was punished. North Korea has a multi-generational punishment policy. And his grandfather had been accused of betraying the government. And as a result, they put his grandmother, his parents, and him and his sister in a political prison camp. And he documents over a decade of his life what it was like living in this camp for 10 years. And it was brutal, and it was so reminiscent of these memoirs I had read about what Nazi concentration camps were like. And I just remember thinking to myself, I wonder how they shut these camps down. I wonder what happened. I was so ignorant to what was happening in North Korea. And I get to the end, and he manages to be released from the prison, and he immediately escapes and goes on to South Korea. And I couldn't believe that I finished this book, and I felt so unsettled. First of all, embarrassed that I never knew that this existed and was happening in North Korea. I think with how much knowledge and information we have in the world today, the fact that so few people probably know the truth about what's going on in North Korea. And so I think it was in that moment that I said, I need to figure out if there's anything that I can do. And that sort of was the impetus for me to get involved and to get involved in this issue. The second reason is because I am of Korean heritage, and my grandmother is actually from North Korea. But growing up, that meant nothing to me. I was born here in the United States. I didn't have a strong connection to my culture, my history, my heritage. And when I was a bit older, I began to have more interest. But reading this book was the first time I felt a deep connection actually to being both Korean and even having North Korean in my family. For me, it was also a personal issue. My grandmother left North Korea to visit her brother in Japan. And during the time she was gone, essentially the war broke out, the peninsula was divided, the borders were shut, and she was never able to go back again. She had been married at the time and had 2 children, and she was never able to see them again. She ended up going on to South Korea and remarrying, and that's where my mom was born. So I didn't even know all of that about her life, actually, until I had already been working on this issue probably for a few years. She just had never shared that ever with my mom, her siblings, with anybody. And, learning that it was even more meaningful then, because I'm convinced all the more North Korea is going to open up in our lifetime. And we are going to have an opportunity to go, and there will be no excuse for anyone to say that we had no idea what was happening. And so I look forward to that day in going back and in looking for my family, my husband's family, and going back with our North Korean friends to look for their friends and family as well.
Really, really compelling and such a powerful story. And, I, even hearing you talk, am reminded of just how blind and unaware I've been, because I think there is this brand around North Korea that makes it easy just to go, oh, well, that's North Korea, right? And you can choose not to look at it. So let's talk briefly about 2 things. One, give an overview of what Link is, of what you do in Liberty for North Korea. And then I want to know specifically about how your leadership shows up in Link, and how you manage the desire to be hands-on, and you're super passionate, but you're also leading a brand that has to scale, right? You want to see the impact grow. What's that tension point for you of wanting to be involved and at the same time scaling something beyond you? But let's begin with what Liberty North Korea is.
Okay. So Liberty in North Korea, we are an international NGO. We're a nonprofit based here in the United States. And essentially, we exist to work with the North Korean people to achieve their freedom. So our vision is essentially our name, Liberty in North Korea, and working toward the day when 25 million North Korean people have achieved their freedom. So how do we do that? The first is we actually help North Korean refugees escape. So if they have made the decision, the very dangerous decision, and have risked their lives to try to escape North Korea, we meet them in the border area or in China, and we help move them through a sort of modern day underground railroad. And we help them to escape from China to Southeast Asia, where we then are able to help them eventually get to South Korea or the United States and resettle as refugees. That work has obviously been hindered pretty significantly throughout the pandemic, but we are slowly beginning to pick up again our rescue work, which is very exciting and positive. But again, this is incredibly dangerous, this route. And, the risks that they face are not only in moving through so many of these countries, but because the Chinese government doesn't recognize them as refugees and will instead punish them or forcibly send them back, where they will face severe punishment from the North Korean regime. So our work helps people to escape safely, to resettle in freedom, to begin new lives. And then we really believe in working together with North Koreans that have escaped in terms of trying to develop and build the capacity within the community of North Korean defectors so that we can activate and cultivate and work with more sort of agents of change, people who want to work on this issue with us, see a free North Korea, that want to be able to, be a part of this really important issue. And so we do capacity building programs, and we support North Koreans in finding success in their new lives. The other part of the work that we do is a pretty cool part of the work. We call it Link Labs. And this is a really vital part of our strategy in seeing an open and free North Korea. And so one of the ways that we know we can accelerate change inside this incredibly closed country is by finding ways to secretly get information and technology into the country, into the hands of North Korean people, so that they can become more aware of the outside world. So a lot of the work we do in this area, it's not public, but it's probably some of the most important work that we're doing outside of helping people escape, because this is ultimately really important for North Korean people inside the country to be able to increase their awareness of the outside world. And we've seen the impact of that happen throughout history in countries that are authoritarian, that are closed, where, the government relies on the ability to propagandize or to indoctrinate people with their own propaganda. We saw this during the Cold War. We saw this behind the Iron Curtain. And this is still happening today, as North Korea is one of the most closed authoritarian regimes to exist today. The last area of work is really sort of what you touched on before, which is changing the narrative on North Korea. One of the biggest reasons why scale is so difficult for us organizationally and just on this issue is because either so few people know the truth about North Korea and what's happening, or they have a very different perception of what they think of when they hear North Korea. So before this interview and before you had learned about Liberty in North Korea and our work, if I were to ask you what the first thing is that comes to mind when you hear North Korea, what would you have said?
Other than political drama and controversy, the movie The Interview and how significant of a culture shaper that was. And I'd love to get your opinion on that movie. Did it do good or did it do damage to the cause?
The Interview probably did more damage to the cause than good. I don't want to say that there was no good. What I appreciate about the film is in the back end, before the film came out, they were making all the right efforts to truly understand North Korea, to understand the situation and to get it right. And I really appreciate that. And I actually think the depiction of some of the parts of the film are somewhat accurate, So it was an opportunity to show a depiction of North Korea to a more mainstream audience. The harm of that, though, was the same thing that, I don't know if you recall, even before The Interview, was Team America. And that also was a huge culture shaper as well on North Korea. When Kim Jong-il died, you have the leader of this country. When he died, Team America was trending on Twitter. So that is, I think, how much of a culture shaper Team America was, and the same with The Interview. And I think with The Interview,
Mm.
what it did was these films make North Korea sometimes just seem like a joke, or it is
Right.
also, it also, to be honest, because of what happened with Sony, it scares companies. It scares media companies especially, but it scares companies away from North Korea. And we have come across this time and time again where
Right.
corporations, companies, media platforms are nervous, are scared to partner with us, to do anything on the issue, because they'll just chalk it up to saying it's too political of an issue. But there is a real concern or
Yeah.
fear that they have because of that. And this keeps happening. And
Yeah.
it's so frustrating and challenging. I mean, I understand those concerns, but it's across the spectrum, Ted. I mean, even to try to get a celebrity or some person of influence to get, there isn't like a very prominent celebrity that is behind this issue the way that you'll see on some of these other issues. And a
Sure.
big part
No,
of
of
that
course.
is whether that's because of those kinds of repercussions or the fact that these days China is a huge influence. And if people do business in China, if they're trying to sell films or sell music or
Yeah.
do any of that, it becomes very difficult for them.
Your organization is attempting to rebrand one of the most challenging brands and brand perceptions that
Yes.
I can imagine on the global scene right
Yeah.
now. All for good cause, all for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
You have an advertising background. You understand brand and I would imagine marketing strategy and maybe PR and all of those disciplines. What's the intersection of that? How do you, because I've got to say, I watched your video on what being a refugee is like.
Mm.
And it was hilarious. It was well done. It felt almost entertaining and informing. And to me, it's everything that you want for nonprofits. Talk to me about the intersection of all these disciplines and how you're leveraging them for Link.
One of my biggest clients when I worked there was a CPG, massive CPG company, and worked on this huge campaign during my time at the agency. And it was about it was the Dove campaign, True Beauty, and it's still here today, which is really crazy to me that it was that successful that the campaign still exists today. What I realized by working in advertising and doing that kind of work was there is a direct connection to being able to create desire, to creating a perceived need, to creating brand affinity, to changing the way people physically feel about products or things or all of that through the incredible power of advertising, marketing, and PR. Vic Harrison from Charity Water, she's shared this quote before, and it's this great quote by Nicholas Kristof, who says, toothpaste is peddled with more sophistication than the world's most life-saving causes. That hits me so hard because that is so true and sad. When you look at everything that goes into, I was just having a conversation with somebody that works in the digital marketing space, and it is astonishing to me the level by which companies can track and collect data and know things and put ideas into your mind and follow you around on social media and target you. And to think about everything that goes into what companies are able to do today, and then to think about if only we could apply a quarter of the resources, a quarter of those tactics, a quarter of that knowledge to some of the world's greatest issues, wouldn't we be in a better place in terms of solving some of these problems that our world is facing today?
Everything that you shared is the reason why we exist, even as an agency that I'm a part of with Mark. I mean, it's that conviction that the world is a better place when nonprofits win, and unfortunately, they've been antiquated and lack not innovating, and the marketplace has outpaced. And it's why we're seeing so much shift to consumer good cause brands.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, so how do you leverage innovation and change for liberty in North Korea? What does it look like for you to innovate and push yourself into all new places and take this brand even further? What are those hurdles and those obstacles ahead for you?
We have a massive opportunity that has never, I mean, honestly, there's so much opportunity when it comes to North Korea, right? We could look at it as so many issues and so many challenges and barriers, but there's so much opportunity for creativity and for innovation that has not yet been tried, both in the nonprofit space and I think especially on the North Korea issue. And so the first thing is really just surrounding myself with incredible people that I work with, people on our staff and on our board that believe so much in this issue, that believe in the North Korean people, that are inspired by their resilience and their innovation themselves, that that I think that that's what really motivates a lot of pushing ourselves to say we can't just settle for what's there, but we need to be more creative. So on that front, I think it's really just an openness. It's a curiosity and it's an openness. It's, we just have an opportunity to bring anything to the table and to really be able to explore that.
Where do you look in the for-profit world or other areas? Who inspires you? Where are you finding best practices or a level of expertise that you would want to bring back or connect to your nonprofit?
I think that for me, it's a lot of just looking at what is being done that's out there, that's creative, that's new. And it's whether that's looking at, subscribe to like random newsletters and articles, or even in Korea. I'm not Gen Z, but I subscribe to a lot of like Gen Z materials because it's a demographic and it's a generation I need to understand better and I believe in so much. I think a young generation, I think, will sadly inherit this issue, but I hope will be the generation that will be able to see an open and free North Korea. They will be the ones to work alongside our North Korean friends. And it will be in my lifetime too. But again, I think it's this idea of we just have to challenge ourselves to be more creative. So in other words, I think that with North Korea, I look at peripheral issues, for example. So one of the ideas has been, you don't want to go after your typical audience, people who like care about the world or just care about refugees, trafficking, human rights issues. One of the interesting kind of approaches that we've taken is Korea is having its moment right now. Korean food, Korean culture, Korean movies, and we should absolutely be capitalizing on that. And so what you find and what's so interesting is back in the day, remember, it used to be Francophiles, people who were obsessed with everything French. And these days, I'm always so impressed with young people and people all around the world of all ethnicities and cultures and different countries. They're watching Korean dramas and listening to K-pop, and they are loving Korean food. And so we are thinking to ourselves, well, a lot of times when somebody is interested in a country and their culture and their food, it's kind of all things that are associated. And so we're trying to really, what we've seen is people that naturally have a tendency toward those things tend to have an affinity to also caring then about peripheral issues. And when we introduce this issue of North Korean human rights or North Korean refugees, there has been a positive response of interest. And so then it goes as far as say, well, then how do we collaborate? How do we collaborate on food? Can we find our North Korean friends who are chefs and entrepreneurs and are doing their own thing and bring that here? Can we collaborate with the BuzzFeeds and the Tasties and do cool things? We haven't been able to yet. So if you're listening, please call me. Would love to do something. But, in all seriousness, it's finding these creative things. I understand what it means to be a consumer and to be somebody that may not care at all about these issues. So how do I get into their shoes? And I don't want to shove my issue down their throat, but I want them to be interested and I want it to be relevant. Yeah. And if they like Korean food, maybe they'd like North Korean food.
It's a really good angle of positive exploitation for good cause. Let's do for Korea what Jose Andres has done for Ukraine. There are more famous Korean chefs in New York right now than there ever has been because of restaurants like Kochi and Mari and Atomics and Attaboy and all these Michelin-starred amazing Korean restaurants. And to be able to tap into those kind of celebrity kitchens and chefs and connect your cause is a huge opportunity for innovation. It's a really good point. I mean, riding this wave of Korean culture to increase your point. Do you find your greatest challenge as a leader in this moment is having space and time to think innovatively and get out of the weeds? Do you feel like you're in the weeds, or do you find time to get out of the weeds and dream and think about that stuff? Like, what's that balance for you?
I am so in the weeds these days, and I think it's become a byproduct of the pandemic. Just so much change and pivoting, and there were so many challenges and people leaving, and we're just, you're struggling through so many of those things that, to be very honest, there hasn't been a ton of space for that. And it's so frustrating because I know that a lot of times, if I'm not doing that, if I'm not thinking about these things, and if I'm not the one thinking about our vision and strategy, no one is. And so I think that that's really,
Yeah.
I've been super convicted by that, especially towards the end of last year when I was really starting to feel burned out. I've worked on this issue for over 15 years. And last year was the first time I started to really, that burnout started to creep up on me. And so I think that it's again, it's a number of things that have kind of led to this point, but really catching that. You're actually catching me. I'm finally heading out on my sabbatical, which has been long delayed. So I'm on sabbatical starting next week, which I'm very excited about.
Nice. So you're taking a break. You're getting
I'm
rest.
taking a break. I need a break, and yeah.
When you think about the pandemic, what was the greatest contribution, positive contribution, and what was the greatest challenge or negative to liberty in North Korea? Or to you personally as a leader of liberty in North Korea?
I think the most positive thing about the pandemic was this incredible, deep, genuine sense of community that I felt very grateful for. And that was not just within like our staff and our team, but it was from our supporters. I think it was such an encouragement to see how people, no matter where they were or how they were struggling or what was going on, I think especially in that first year of the pandemic, nonprofits really benefited. It was almost this incredible, the world came together to protect, right? Like that's what it felt like in some ways. We had so much, like for donors to be emailing me and to be like, thank you for continuing to do this work, or we're so happy to support her. It was like people that had never reached out before. It was such an encouragement, and it was so important, I think, for our team to continue to press on through the challenges we were facing. And so I was incredibly grateful for that. And it was a deep sense of community that was so necessary. We needed each other in a way that I don't think we had ever felt before. We have always been a close community. Our team is super close, but it was just so different. I don't know quite how to explain it, but it was something that I feel like we are even closer after having gone through all of that together. And we went through some personal stuff, including within our staff. We had someone on our staff pass away during the pandemic, and that was really devastating.
Oh,
and so
sorry.
That was really, I think, a positive thing. And I think just the upside in general to the world was, oh, we can do a lot of things remotely, actually. We can work from home. We can, still be really effective and efficient, but be apart. And we can still do great things. And I think that was cool to see. The hardest part was a feeling of helplessness. It was especially on our work. You had borders shutting down. We were getting requests for help from North Koreans who had escaped and were stuck in China. I mean, and China was the most shut down out of everywhere else. That's where the pandemic started. So it was so frustrating and challenging and so restrictive and sad. It's like, here we are at home, safe, even if we're sheltering and we're having to be indoors and not go out. But yet it was this notion of, one, North Korean people in North Korea, they don't really have freedom of movement to begin with, and yet the North Korean government is taking advantage of the situation to further enforce more surveillance and restrictions on movement and that kind of stuff. North Koreans still are not vaccinated in that country. It is one of the last countries in the world to have not had access to vaccinations and to not vaccinate people. And so, just the incredible amount of death we were hearing cases of people starving to death again in North Korea because they couldn't have access to resources and food and goods. And then people who were stuck, they were trying to escape. They couldn't go anywhere. They were hiding in shelters for months. It was just really, you felt helpless.
So the majority of the people listening to this are leaders of or in nonprofits who are probably struggling with all sorts of things around growth, scale, attention, modernizing their brand to look as great as yours does. If you could go back to the beginning and do something differently, I mean, you're clearly a young leader of a nonprofit. What would you do differently? What advice would you give yourself? What would you change in your journey of building Link?
I wish I had taken more risks. And I'm a very risk-averse person, and I think that's actually been very beneficial as well, because I feel like that was one of the most important ways in which we were able to build our brand and credibility and trust is by being careful about the risks that we took. So I don't regret that at all. I do just wish that sometimes I had pushed myself to be willing and open to take more risks. And I say that now because
what would that have looked like?
What I realized is we do this incredible work and nobody knows. And part of that is just this notion of like, people will find out, they will know. I don't need to be out there tooting our own horn. I don't need to spend my time going out and promoting Link or, promoting this kind of stuff. I know that sounds ridiculous. And I feel ridiculous saying that. But in the very beginning, it was so much about just keep our head down, focus on this. Let's make sure that what we're doing is real. It's legitimate. We're having an impact. We're just focusing on that. So there were opportunities that I would pass, whether it was interviews or going out. And part of that was just my lack of comfortableness of being in front of a camera or doing these things. And also just feeling awkward about promoting Link. And I did not feel confident yet. And it was definitely imposter syndrome, which I know everybody struggles with, and especially in the beginning, and especially as you're figuring things out. But it was so much about feeling like I needed to have all the answers. I needed to know that our theory of change was solid. I needed to know that we knew exactly what we're doing and we had impact to prove, and that all of these things were lined up before I could go out there and start tooting our own horn and talking about what we're doing. I think the other part of that too was I wanted to be careful that the brand that we created for Liberty in North Korea was at the end of the day about the North Korean people. Because I could come and go and a new person would come in, but if I were to ever leave and that brand had been built around me, that doesn't serve the issue. That doesn't serve the cause. And to be honest, I'm the least important person when it comes to this work, actually. If I cannot help people to be interested in North Korean people stories and just how incredible they are, that to me was the most important thing at the end of the day, was that you would walk away knowing Joseph's story or Tanbi's story or somebody else's story, not Hannah's story, because actually that wasn't the most important thing. There was a need to be able to humanize the North Korea issue, the North Korean people, and for how would we define success of redefining North Korea, rebranding North Korea? It's that when we go out and you ask somebody, when you think about North Korea, what's the first thing you think about? That it could be a specific story of a North Korean person. It was a memoir they read, somebody's experience.
I think what you've said so articulately is that you wanted the brand to scale around the cause and the people you're serving, not the leader or the charisma or articulate leadership person behind the brand that is such a part of our culture that the cause almost gets lost. But maybe you underplayed your leadership or your role or didn't take risks you could have taken, and that in hindsight are things where you could have accelerated the brand further. Maybe not, but you have certainly not built this around you. I mean, I go to the website and look, and this is not you centric at all. Let me ask one last question. What does scale look like in the future? How do you continue to grow, broaden awareness? Are you just on an organic journey, or are you trying to pour some miracle grow on that? Like, what does the future look like for growth and scale?
That's a great question, Ted. I am learning. That is the biggest I think obstacle opportunity is, I feel like so much of what I'm trying to do so often is either bring experts in that can help me to answer that question. I have an idea, we have a vision, and one of that is, our goal is to be able to recruit 25 million people, allies to this cause. People that will say, yes, I stand with the North Korean people. I believe in them. And that's it, simply.
Right.
And people can go to withthenorthkoreanpeople.org. And that's literally all it is saying, just like you could stand with the Ukrainian people, you can stand with people in Afghanistan, come and say that you stand with the North Korean people. It is the simplest thing you can do. I promise you that it will combat apathy. But how do we get 25 million people to come alongside us and to support North Korean people if they don't even know what's going on in North Korea? So I am trying to learn and figure out digital marketing. I have an incredible guy on my team. We are constantly trying to figure out ways to collaborate, find new audiences, tell the stories of North Korean people, find more platforms for our North Korean friends to share their stories, come up with cool programs. It's all of it. It's all of it and everything.
We're very familiar with that journey of creating a movement. And so for you, the very simple, modest goal of 25 million people affiliating with Liberty North Korea. Let's do it. I mean, how hard can it be? It's just 25 million people. There's a lot more.
Absolutely.
This has been really inspiring, very helpful. I think you're at a brink and at a tipping point. Clearly, your leadership has been helpful and brought this movement to a place. I think it would be powerful to see what's been happening in Iran and other parts in social media happen for North Korea. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing if the public was awakened to the humanity of North Korea, not just the craziness of all the media and politics that have surrounded it? So,
absolutely.
For more stories from experts in the industry and to learn how to take your nonprofit into the future, like this video, subscribe to our channel and podcast, and visit makehistoric.com/insights. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Ted Vaughn, and this is Future Nonprofit.